Welcome, Dr. Koop.
Thank you very much.
It's a pleasure to be with you this evening. Thank you for giving us your time. In reading about your illustrious career as Surgeon General, but even before then, one thing that strikes me about your career is that you broke a lot of barriers. And it seems that when barriers get broken, a lot of other things get broken along with them. So I just want to say it's a good thing you're a formidable figure, because you had to be the shock absorber for a lot of broken barriers. You've paved the way for a lot of particularly Christian people who want to interact with culture, and we thank you for your model. The first question I'd like to ask you, if we could maybe look back a little bit before we move into the muck and mud of what you had to face as Surgeon General. Was there a defining moment in your early life as a child or a young person that in some way became for you the epiphany or the revelation that you wanted to be a servant of the damaged and wounded and helpless human beings that ended up becoming your career trajectory?
I wish I could say that I thought about it for years and finally achieved my goal. But like so many things that happened to me in my life, I just think the Lord opened a door and shoved me through it. And sometimes I wasn't smart enough to walk through on my own, but I really got shoved. I can tell you that from the time I was 5, I wanted to be a doctor. From the time I was 6, I wanted to be a surgeon, although I didn't know what that really meant. I did follow that through, but all of the little side paths I took and the specialty I ended up in were all more things that were done for me rather than by my own intelligence seeking a way to do things that I wanted to do.
Can you give me an example of something that was done for you?
Well, I can give you a perfect example. I was finishing my residency at the hospital of the University of Pennsylvania, having been declared essential to that university during World War II. And I had a strep throat, and my colleagues put me to bed and started intravenous. I could hardly swallow. And the next morning at about 5 o'clock, the door of my room burst open, and in came a general in the Army who happened to be the man who had given me my job as a resident and as a surgical fellow at the University of Pennsylvania. And he said, "Chick, what do you want to do with your life?" And so I started off a funny throat, and I said, "Well, Dr. Abden, I've come to love Philadelphia, the University of Pennsylvania. I'd like to stay here. And there's one weak spot in your whole program, and that's your tumor clinic. If you'll give me that, I'll make it sing for you." And he said, "How would you like to be the surgeon and chief of the Children's Hospital instead?" I said, "It's my second choice."
Really?
So those are the kinds of things that happen. And my going to Washington, I turned down the offer to be Surgeon General 3 times before my wife finally convinced me that I better do what was on the schedule for me.
Were there days that you didn't feel like thanking her for that?
No, I loved, well, the first 11 months, I have to tell you, were pure hell. Because I didn't have a friend in Washington, and I had all sorts of people who would spend as much money as they had to keep me from being the Surgeon General, because I was a threat to them, usually for the wrong reasons. I came to Washington, I'm probably getting ahead of your story, but I said at dinner tonight, I hate labels. And I came to Washington covered with labels. And every time my name was mentioned in the paper, all the labels were in quotation marks following my name. And that wasn't pleasant at all, because I wasn't any of those things. But once the confirmation process was over, those were the happiest days of my life. That was a marvelous job, and if I had the stamina to do it again, I'd like to try.
Really? Well, that's actually a good segue into the next question that I wanted to ask you. In his book, Soul Survivor, Philip Yancey has a chapter about you in it. And he talked in that chapter about how you were able to mold that office to fit your own strengths, that position as the Surgeon General. It might be helpful and beneficial for our listeners who could yet be unclear as to how exactly the Surgeon General functions, who the Surgeon General is. If you could enlighten us a little bit on that, and I'm particularly interested to hear about how you did mold the office to fit your own strengths, and especially the significance of the uniform that I know was real important to you.
Yeah. Okay. Here's the HHS, a cabinet department, about 65,000 people in it, and they are, well, for the most part, civil servants. And they have job descriptions, and if you want them to do something, you say, would you please do so-and-so? And they can say, not in my job description, I don't want to do that, and that's their job. In the middle of that great big bunch, there is a corps, C-O-R-P-S, and C-O-R-E, of commissioned officers. And when I went to Washington, there were 8,200 of them, all officers, no enlisted men and women. They're doctors and nurses and nutritionists and veterinarians and physiotherapists and sanitarians, and they are the people who work under the Uniform Code of Military Justice, and they don't say, no, I don't want to do that. They are under the command of somebody called the Surgeon General, who says go, and they go, and they salute before they go, and they salute when they come back.
And you had to learn how to do the salute properly.
Well, I knew the right hand was the right hand. I had that much down. But I had to learn the snap and things like that because one of the interesting things about my being Surgeon General is, you know, the people who work in a job in the military or in the public health service, which is one of the 9 uniformed services of the United States, they work their way by very difficult tasks up to that position. And the highest position you can have in the public health service is a vice admiral, which is 3 stars. And all the people who were under me have been working at it for years and years and years, and I just came in and took the job at the top. And it's the only way to do it, really, you know, to come in at the top and not have to do all those 30 years of trial and error.
Well, you had your own trials. But
I had my trials, but that's what the public health service is. And the first thing that happened, and we'll answer your question about the uniform, Mr. Reagan knew almost as little about the public health service when he came to Washington as I did. And he inquired what it was, and he was told. And what most people don't know is we are older than the Navy. We went into business in 1798 under John Adams as the Marine Hospital Corps. And at that time, we had a huge merchant marine, sailing vessels all over the world, and those men frequently got sick and many times died on their voyages because no one knew anything about nutrition or vitamins. They came back with scurvy or rickets or pellagra or something like that, and they had to have somebody to take care of them. And that's what John Adams created in the Marine Hospital Service. And we wore uniforms like the Merchant Marine did, and that has gone on through all these years, and we have essentially copied the uniform of the Navy, although we reserve the right to do some things that we will. Well, Mr. Reagan heard that we took care of merchant mariners, and he asked a question that you might expect from somebody other than the president. He said, why don't they have Blue Cross Blue Shield like I have? And we explained that that was a little difficult to do for people who were in Madagascar one year and Hawaii the next. And lo and behold, he, with poor advice from somebody, closed all the marine hospitals. And so overnight, in the first month I was in Washington, we lost 2,200 of our doctors and nurses primarily, as well as other hospital people. And it wasn't just that we lost them, but these 8 hospitals around the country were our training centers, because the Commissioned Corps, of which I was the chief, they take care of the health of the Coast Guard. They backfill for the Navy. They take care of all federal prisoners, all Native Americans and Alaska Natives. And we do a tremendous number of things that most people don't ever think about and certainly don't know much about. Well, the morale of the 6,000 people left just plummeted. And they had very loose, non-stringent rules about the uniform. And although I was not yet confirmed as the Surgeon General, my suggestion was if they went back to wearing their uniform, they could just look around Washington and see who else was hurting the way they were. And that's why the uniform came back in my time, and I always wore the uniform at any time that I was doing something where I was the Surgeon General of the United States.
And did that have the effect you were hoping?
It had just the effect that I wanted, and eventually I got control of the whole Commissioned Corps, and then I really put in some rules and regulations, and they still are in effect. And if you went to Washington today and watched the Public Health Service, you'd see that most of them who can wear a uniform and are not working in an operating room or something like that are wearing it, and it does a tremendous amount for morale, but it also does an awful lot for the people that we serve. The Native Americans are very pleased to see somebody trig, washed, in the uniform, coming to take care of them instead of somebody coming with the sneakers untied and no necktie.
Yeah. Well, I'd like to ask you about that 9-month trial period you went through before your confirmation, but I'm going to skip over that. We can suffice it to say that was a very trying time and a lot of
It was a very trying time. I should just say one thing about it, very short. The reason that I had opposition from anybody was because of my very strong stand against abortion. And whatever people said about me, they very seldom mentioned abortion. They said I was incompetent, I was Dr. Kook, I was Dr. Unqualified. It was a very terrible time for me and my family.
Oh, I can only imagine. Well, we'll get back to that because I'm going to talk to you about the whole abortion issue. As I mentioned earlier, you were a breaker of barriers, and so in many ways yourself got broken, but you're a strong man, and you stayed on your feet, and you've paved the way as a role model for many of us. And that's where I want to go right now, is talk about how when you came into the position of Surgeon General, you had to confront the intersection of a life of faith and deep morality and intense personal sense of values and absolutes. And at the same time, you were juxtaposed with the culture of politics that in so many ways stands against the kinds of things that as a man of integrity you uphold. Augustine called it the city of God and the city of man.
Yeah.
You were right in that vortex. And it seems as if there were 3 particular issues that arose during your tenure that kind of defined the struggle that can happen when the city of God and the city of man come into collision. And if you don't mind, I'd like to talk a little bit about those.
Sure.
The first one has just been called the baby doe controversy or situation, which took place early in your tenure, 1982, 1983. Reading about it, actually, I found this somewhat confusing because the baby doe, I'll let you explain what it was, but it seemed as if you were very much advocating for governmental oversight when these handicapped children were being kind of thrown away, and yet at the same time, as this controversy evolved, you were called into question by some of the conservatives. Could you help me understand that?
I'll try to make it clear. It was a confusing time, and baby doe was a child that was born in Bloomington, Indiana, and it had 2 things wrong with it. Its esophagus ended right here, and so it couldn't swallow. And the esophagus that joins the stomach, instead of hooking onto the upper esophagus, went into the windpipe. So the child was exposed to pneumonia by swallowing its own saliva into its lungs and by having gastric juices, which are acid, come up and go down in the lung as well. The second thing the child had was Down syndrome, and the obstetrician who delivered that baby knew nothing about either. And he told these poor little parents that, first of all, their child would be a blob, and he had no right to say that, and there's no statistics to indicate that. The way a Down syndrome child grows in our society depends upon how much the society puts into that child. And he also said that the mortality for the operation to fix the esophagus was better than 50%. Now, I was a pediatric surgeon, and I probably had operated on more baby does than anybody in the world. And yet nobody in the government ever asked me what I thought about it at all. And this thing all took place around me, and suddenly we had a crisis on our hands with a doctor who didn't know what he was doing, a judge who didn't know what he was doing, making the decision that the family could do what they wanted to do, and they, of course, having a blob with an operative mortality of 50%, said, we don't want our child to be operated upon. I should just tell you that my operative mortality for the previous 8 years in a full-term baby like that was 0. And no reason why that child couldn't have been successfully operated upon and properly raised. The child died on the 15th day, and President Reagan said he never wanted to see that happen again on his watch, and machinery was put into place that was improper. There were signs put up in hospitals that made parents suspicious of doctors and nurses, and of course, when they were sued by the AMA and the American Academy of Pediatrics and all those people, and who did they call for their expert witness to defend them was C.E. Koop. And we lost that case, as we should have, and they immediately tried another set of rules, not quite as stringent, but still onerous, and we lost that case as well. And they were getting ready to do the third set of rules and regulations, and I went to Margaret Heckler, who was the Secretary of HHS, and I said, if you...
Excuse me, would you just tell for our audience, HHS means?
Health and Human Services. It's a cabinet department. It used to be Health, Education, and Welfare, then Health and Human Services, and if I had my way, there would be a health department here and a human services department here. We are the only country in the world that doesn't have a man in the cabinet who is dedicated to health alone, and we need it.
Thank you. Sorry for the interruption.
So I went to Margaret Heckler and I said, if you expect me to be the expert witness to defend the government, I want to write the rules and regulations. Seems reasonable, she said, and so I did. I accomplished that. We sat around a table 5 times as big as this, and people who were enemies began to work together. We wrote something called the Patient's Bill of Rights for newborn infants. And it was one of the best times of my life to see how you could bring people together. Now, we were still sued, and we still lost the case. But in the meantime, Ted Kennedy, senator from Massachusetts, lifted the whole problem of baby doe out of the problems of handicapped children and put it in the child abuse situation. So that took care of itself, but it stands as a landmark case of infanticide. And it had a lot to do with the life I had led before. I don't know whether you plan to get into this, but before I went to Washington, I had written a book with Francis Schaeffer and made 5 one-hour movies with him. And the first 3 films were abortion, infanticide, and euthanasia. And the other 2 were Christian answers to those dilemmas. And another thing that I presume your audience doesn't know is that Ronald Reagan was one of the few presidents that ever wrote a book while he was in office. And if you don't believe that there are conspiracies among newspapers and publishers, I don't think that the fact that he wrote that book is known, but I also know that it was sold millions of copies, never appeared on a bestseller list, but the book had 3 chapters. The first chapter was by the president himself on abortion. It was called Abortion and the Right of a Nation. The second was a chapter by me on infanticide, baby doe stuff, and I called it The Slide to Auschwitz. And the third chapter was on euthanasia and was written by Malcolm Muggeridge, former atheist, former editor of Punch magazine in England, and now a solid Christian and certainly a stellar pro-life advocate. But there's an example. You can't find that book anyplace today. It's really a collector's item, but it was buried by the publishing industry because they didn't like the content.
Well, part of the whole baby doe controversy, at least in terms of the conservatives that arose, came with this notion of patient care committees in hospitals. Could you help me understand why that would create a controversy and impugn your reputation as a pro-life doctor? Well,
up until baby doe, the situation was between the doctor and the family, and the baby, of course, was the object of their concern. What the 2 initial laws that were struck down and mine provided for was a reasonable group of people who met and talked over the pros and cons, and what we did was to determine under what circumstances you could even think that it's better to kill a child than to let it live. And we ended up in that morass of the word futility. And we said that it is always necessary to save the life of a child unless the operative procedure, for example, would be considered futile. And one of the best things that happened, and again that the world doesn't know about, while this was all going on, President Reagan had appointed a commission on biomedical ethics. And they had concluded that if you had a child with Down syndrome, it was perfectly okay to assume that that would not be a sufficiently normal child that a family would want to raise, which is not true either. And it was perfectly okay, therefore, not to feed that child. And I went to the chairman of that committee, and I said, let's not talk about a baby doe, let's talk about you. Suppose you suddenly are hit by a car, and you're lying in a bed in the hospital, and they say, you know, his head is damaged, he's had some problems with his digestive tract because of the way he was hit, and if he recovers, he's not going to have all the marbles he had before. He may not be able to use his bladder. He probably will not be able to walk without crutches. The question, sir, is do we save your life or do we not? And he went back and changed the whole report to the president and said that any defective child was entitled to every single thing that a normal child was. And that was a tremendous victory.
So the patient care committees then, did that ever end up coming into fruition?
They still exist. Most hospitals have an ethical patient care committee, and they function in two ways. If you were a doctor and you wanted to do a clinical study on 40 patients for some reason or other, you would have to pass your protocol around that committee, and they would have to say, no harm will be done. This will benefit the children that are being tested, and in the long run will benefit other children that know nothing about this. And for an individual case, you would decide whether or not there was sufficient reason not to proceed as you would with a normal child, and if so, you would have to defend it very strongly. Now, those boards and hospitals do not function with the same accuracy that they did right after they were committed, because all things tend to fade away. But it changed the way we were thinking, and this rapid slide that I called the slide to Auschwitz was stopped.
Did it create indignation in the part of some conservatives because these committees did entertain the option of terminating a life?
Well, it was not only that, but it put somebody in the position of acting on a government mandate. And you know, one of the things that conservatives don't want at all is the government until they're in trouble.
Okay, so that was essentially the point of contention. Okay, thank you for explaining that. There was another controversy that you found yourself in the center of, almost serendipitously, and that's the whole AIDS hysteria. At the time when you came into office, we really hadn't known very much about AIDS. There were some rumors going around. We knew there was a disease that was somewhat mysterious that seemed to be fatal. But it was under your watch that AIDS really came into focus, and you, again, had to bear the brunt of this initial hysteria that really pervaded the nation when it came to how to understand this disease. And then you wrote this report that was very nuts and bolts, very clear-cut, very no-nonsense. And in many ways, it seemed as if it stayed a lot of the potential for nationwide epidemic beyond what it had already become, but at the same time you seem to have alienated some more people in this report. Can you help us understand that situation?
Let me start by saying I gave a lecture in Atlanta a couple of weeks ago, and the Centers for Disease Control is there, and I was talking to one of their chiefs, and he said something that I have believed myself for a long time, but it was very nice to hear it from him. He said, I don't know, Chick, where AIDS would be today if you hadn't been where you were when you were. I went into office as the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Health in March of 1981, and in June, the first cases of AIDS were presented to us. We didn't call it AIDS then, but they were all homosexual men, and they had a very peculiar type of pneumonia that nobody around the table had ever seen except me. And then in September, they presented 23 cases of homosexual men who had a peculiar type of sarcoma called Kaposi sarcoma, again, which nobody had seen except me, and I'd only seen one case. And to suddenly have 23 cases in one city was overpowering. And all of a sudden, AIDS was on us, and we had this tremendous lack of knowledge because we didn't know what caused the disease, we didn't know how to test for the disease, we didn't know it was passed by blood, but it became associated with drug abuse, with sexual promiscuity, and with IV drug paraphernalia. And a huge number of the conservatives in this country said they deserve what they got, just ignore them and let them die. Well, you can't be a doctor and do that. You can't be the Surgeon General and do that. I'm the Surgeon General of the moral and the immoral, the males and the females, and you treat them as you would any patient that comes to you for help. And if I had known more about what the Surgeon General was supposed to do, I probably would have been too timid to do some of the things that I did. But I stepped into a job that nobody gave me. I became, more or less by circumstance and pressure, the government spokesperson for AIDS. And in so doing, I was able to stop the hysteria because people would have thought in those days that if I picked up your wristwatch strap, I could get AIDS. If I drank out of your glass, I could. If we shook hands, I could. If I used your typewriter, we could. And I made it very clear in the report Mr. Reagan asked me to write for the people how you did not get AIDS. That was a tremendous benefit to the public. And how you did get AIDS. And I made the point that we were fighting a disease and not the people who had it. And you said I caused controversy. Everything I ever said caused controversy. And that's because of the nature of the job. If we had an anthrax scare here in Chicago tonight and the Surgeon General said, this is what I think you should do, he'd split the public. Half would say he's crazy, the other half would say, isn't it good we've got that man doing this job? And the interesting thing is these people who are against you and these are for you, next week might change sides when you say something else. And so it's a controversial job, and you have to have a very thick skin, and you cannot let yourself be pushed by political pressures about what is politically correct and what is not.
Well, you certainly seem to be the man of the hour for that. The other controversy that I just very briefly want to touch upon, because I think it's pretty evident to one and all that you've been consistently pro-life through your whole career, but there was this letter that you wrote to President Reagan after he had asked you to write a report about the effects of abortion on women. And back again, when all this was going on, things were very politicized. Not that they aren't now, but maybe things have calmed down a little bit. So you, in the attempt to write this report, you found you couldn't get objective information.
Right. Well, it started in the White House in a funny way. A reporter who had worked for the Dartmouth Review, one of the first really conservative college newspapers, and then for the Wall Street Journal, named Dinesh D'Souza, said to the president, if you would get Koop to write a report on the health effects of abortion on women, you could reverse Roe v. Wade. Well, he was wrong on all parts of that statement. We have always focused on abortion on the fetus. If you take your focus off the fetus and talk about the mother, that's like saying you're opposed to strangling because you might hurt the strangler's hands. And that's what I tried to make clear to the president, that he didn't need this kind of report. It would get us nothing but trouble, but having been pushed by people in the pro-life thing who thought that whatever I did about abortion would come out right. And so there were 225 articles at the time that were written on post-abortion syndrome. Excuse me. And I read them. And it was my impression, not being either an epidemiologist or a statistician, that each one of those reports had the bias of the author in reference to abortion. In other words, if he was pro-life, then he said the mothers have a bad effect from abortion. If he was pro-choice, they said the mothers go scot-free and it's only the baby that you have to worry about. And so I got 6 statisticians together, all of reputation in this country, and I said, don't be upset about what I'm saying about you, but I think that you are the least ideological people I know. And I want you to review these 225 papers and tell me what the statistical likelihood is that these prove or do not prove that women are affected by abortion. Well, I had treated myself hundreds of women who were really devastated by abortion. I'd also met women who said, save my marriage, save my RN, save my PhD, and all sorts of things go on in this world, and we don't know all the circumstances involved. And so when this issue was examined by the statisticians, surprisingly enough, they came to exactly the same conclusion I did. They said there's only one paper in here you can trust, and the others all carry the bias of the author about abortion in general. And so I wrote the president, not a report because I couldn't, but a letter. It was 5 pages long. I wrote 17 versions of it, so I'd be sure to get it right. And in it I said, there is no way that with the present evidence and statistics that we can prove, underlined, one way or the other, that abortion is good or bad for women. Well, one of the things about integrity you talk about, Otis Bowen, who was the Secretary of Health and Human Services at that time, and a good friend of mine and a doctor, which is unusual, we went to the White House with my letter addressed to the president, who was in California. And we had the assurance of the person we delivered the letter to, as he said, I will hold it close until the president returns and show it to him when he does next week. Before we got back to our offices, it was on the Associated Press wires, and all of the newscasters of the evening say, Koop finds no connection between abortion and the health of women. That's not what I said. And so I've been misquoted by that. Immediately, all the conservatives that had been pro-life turned against me, and all the people that I had been critical of who were pro-choice said, oh, what a wonderful guy Koop is. And so, you know, we did this again. And that was the life of being a Surgeon General. But nothing good came of that report, but I should tell you one interesting thing. There is a very large organization in this country called the American Psychological Association. And they appointed themselves to be my monitor. And they have no right to do this, but it's a free country. And so they appointed a committee to study me and my reactions to the job I was assigned by the president. And after a year and a half of studying me and my reactions, they put out a press release that said, we can find no fault in the way Koop behaved. He could not have done otherwise with the evidence at hand. But of course, nobody ever saw that report.
Wow, that's interesting. Did they give you a copy?
No, I heard about that from a roundabout way.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, wow. That's very interesting. Thank you for allowing us to navigate through that little minefield there. I'd like to move on in our conversation now to some more personal issues and just also theoretical issues about how a Christian can interact with the mainstream culture. But I'd like to ask you more on a personal level. In the book, at one point, you talk about how daily in your vocation as a surgeon of these damaged babies, you were confronting the pain of the parents, the grief of the parents, and the possibility of them losing this child. And you said in your book at one point you kind of developed the ability to converse with the parents in a way that I think you described it as you developed a certain expertise. And then we know that in 1968 tragedy hit your family because you lost your youngest son. You have 4 children, 1 in heaven, and 3 still living, right? 3 sons and a daughter. And you lost your youngest son when he was 20 years old, is that correct?
Correct.
In a mountain climbing accident. So when you deal with grief-stricken parents after that tragic event, you are certainly not in any way operating out of a vacuum. Would you be willing to share with us, as you feel comfortable with, how that tragedy in your life, in your family's life, informed your ability to function with these grief-stricken parents in these very traumatic situations that they face?
When I said you develop a certain expertise, I was talking not just about ill children, but about children where both the parents and the physician know they're on a futile course and this child will die. And I think that's one of the most difficult things to manage in surgery. I don't think anybody goes out and seeks to do it, but I had so much experience with cancer in children that I got to the point where dying children were part of my life every day, and I did feel that I had developed a way of putting myself in the parent's position and at least introducing them to my faith. And for example, I frequently would have a family who would be just distraught that I was going to operate on their child, and many of the things I did were innovative things, very risky, but on the other hand, if you're going to die, why not take a risk? And I always would say to them the same thing, Mr. and Mrs. Jones, let me assure you that if I thought that I was walking into that operating room under my own steam, my own power, my own knowledge, and was going to operate upon your child, and its survival depended upon me, I wouldn't open the door. I believe that I am a servant of the Lord and that I'm going to that operating room with gifts that He has given me. But your child is in His hands, and He will guide me, and I will let you know everything that I can about the future of your child. That brings them a tremendous sense of comfort, but it also clears the air as to who says what, and that I am not pounding myself on the back and say, hey, what a great surgeon, I can do this and get it through every time. And so I developed a reputation for being that kind of a person in a tough situation. And when my son died, if you ever have to go through an experience like this, you look for everything you can to wring something good out of that experience. So I said, you know, you think you're an expert in dealing with dying children, now you know what it's like, and you'll be ever so much better. Well, to my great surprise, I couldn't even talk to a family without crying. And there's a very funny thing about medicine. You're taught early on, the one thing you never do is break down and cry before a parent. And I don't know what the reason is. I guess it's a sign of weakness. But nevertheless, that's what I did. Now, I have to give you a little side story about this. I had operated on a little girl at the Children's Hospital. I knew she was going to die eventually, but she lasted about 3 years. And her mother was a Christian, and she was a sweet little girl. And I went and spent the last hour with her. She was alive, and knelt at the side of her bed, and we talked about where she was going in heaven and what it would be like. I said I didn't know, except it was so great I couldn't explain it. She said, but my grandmother will be there, won't she? And so that's the way she died, knowing that she was on the way to see her grandmother. Well, when the grief of that situation had passed, her mother became the director of the gift shop at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, and the gift shop didn't sell any books, but they sold one book that my wife and I wrote called Sometimes Mountains Move, which was really the story of the grace of God in our lives at the time of our deepest distress. And I got to the point where she, being a Christian mother who'd gone through the death of a child, and the book being down there, I would send my patients who had a tough future with a child down to see her rather than send them to the social service department, because they were getting Christian advice and somebody who'd been through it. And so it was to that lady I went and I said, you know, I feel so disappointed. I thought the one thing that would happen after David died was that I would be able to really relate to these people, and they would feel it, they'd know it. And I said, all I can do is cry. And I said, I'm a failure. And she said, don't you believe it for a minute. She said, just as you send patients down to see me, she said, a lot come in here that you didn't send. And let me tell you that they figure at this particular time that any doctor who feels the grief enough with them of the loss of their child to cry has to be somebody that they can trust. And so here, through a roundabout way, it was really one of the things that God provided me with, and that is a better way of dealing with people, although it was tougher on me every time than it was on them, I think.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I want to ask you about, we mentioned the two categories of Augustine, the city of God and the city of man, and the collision. You were right at the vortex of that collision. And to help us as people who can derive the benefit of your wisdom, how can a member of the city of God, a Christian in other words, who is in the muck and mud of mainstream culture, how can a Christian engage and yet not come away all muddied from the muck and the mud?
Well, I'd like to divide that into two pieces. Let's do it first in the practice of surgery. From the time I became a Christian at the age of about 28, I determined that I would combine my faith and my practice. And I gathered a great many Christian medical students to me in one way or another, and they would always say, how can I witness to my patients and not be accused by people in the hospital of proselytizing or something like that? it's interesting, in these days, with mind-body medicine and prayer being talked about openly in hospitals, it's perfectly okay to talk to patients about their faith. But in the 1960s, if a nurse would have talked to a patient, her supervisor would reprimand her. If a doctor talked to a medical student talked to a patient, a doctor would reprimand him. You were not to confuse your faith with the patient's illness. Anyway, when I talked to medical students who asked me, how do you do this? I would say the first thing that you have to try is to have no taint of mediocrity in your professional life. Or to put it another way, you have to sort of win the right to witness publicly to a patient. And the way to do that is to be the best doctor you can be, to be the most caring human being that you can be, to have the rest of your life without blemish and live with integrity so that nobody can criticize you, but can say, well, if he does that job so well, we'll let him get away with it. It's kind of a funny way to put it, but that's how I got along for years in medicine. Nobody could criticize my surgery, my management of the service, my teaching, my research, and so they put up with this crazy Christian who shared his faith with his patients. Now, it's different when you get to Washington because there you have not only the same things that go on in the culture, but you have this big boogie-boo of mixing church and state. Nobody understands what that means. That has become, instead of mixing church and state, which means you don't want the state to establish a religion, to becoming you don't mix church, you don't mix faith and in God and your practice in life. Well, that's crazy. When I always am amazed at politicians who get on television and say, I can assure you that my faith, I'm a Roman Catholic, I can assure you my faith will have nothing to do with what I say in government. It's impossible. If you're a Roman Catholic, you think like a Roman Catholic. If you're Jewish, you think like a Jew. If you're evangelical Christian, you think like one of those. And if you're an atheist, you think like that. And so your religion, whether you want to or not, becomes a part of your decision-making process. And so you can't separate it in here or in here, and therefore you have to come to grips with it on how the public is going to deal with it. And what I did was to do what I thought was right. I said a minute ago with many, many things that I said people didn't like. But I never saw a press criticize the process that I used to get from the dilemma to the solution I made. And the process I used to get from the dilemma to the solution was my own understanding of personal Christian ethics. And so you could say, to put this whole thing in another way, how did I live in the mucky world? I used my Christian ethics as the modus operandi to reach the place where I had to make a decision. Now, I also took an oath and said that I will uphold the Constitution and blah, blah, blah. So that means that if the law of the land says ABC, I can't stand up as an employee of the government and say, that's rubbish. I tend to avoid it. If I'm pushed on it, then I get to the place. If this were not the government and I were operating in practice, I would tell you I think it's wrong, but it's the law of the land, and I took an oath above. Well, people understand pretty well when you say that. He thinks it's terrible. And so that's how I managed it, and I had, after the first 11 months there, I didn't have any troubles with my faith. I said earlier, I hate labels. Every time my name was mentioned in the first 11 months I was in Washington, it always said, C. Everett Koop, comma, quotation mark, Christian fundamentalist, unquote, and pro-life zealot. Well, those are two labels that really didn't want to live with in Washington. But I made it, and the same thing happened there that I used to tell the medical students about. As soon as the press realized that I was a man of integrity, and that I told it as it is, that I didn't shade it in one way or the other politically, and said many times, if I ever have to say something that I don't believe, I'm going home. Or if I can't say something that I think has to be said, I'm going home. And in the beginning, nobody gave a hoot whether I was going home or not. But as time went on and I became a popular, almost folk hero because of AIDS, nobody wanted to be the person who was sending me home. So a lot of people who didn't like me and who were attached to the Reagan government as ultra-conservatives just held their peace and hoped I'd die.
So in other words, you just maintained your personal integrity and sifted
right.
every decision you made through your own grid of Christian ethics
Right.
and stood your ground.
Right.
I'd like to move into a little bit of a new direction in the time we have left. It's not been enough time, I'm afraid. But I would like to tap your brain a little bit on some of the issues we're facing today. For example, a U.S. Census report called An Aging World 2001 says, quote, global aging is occurring at a rate never seen before, unquote. And they attribute that to the decline in fertility and the advances in keeping people alive longer. Reuters also reported that every month 800,000 people turn 65 worldwide. So we're facing a demographic that's getting older. How should aging Americans face this? Is this going to be a crisis? Are we prepared for this aging constituency? Is it the kind of thing where individuals should take charge of their own health, or what are we looking at?
Well, as a comedian once said, you ain't seen nothing yet. Wait till the present baby boomers start turning 65.
Yeah.
Because right now in this country, 1 out of every 4 people gives up most of his time to the care, medical care, of a member of his family or extended family. And that is because, as you have just implied, we have been so good at dealing with acute disease that we've made a tremendous number of chronically ill people. If you prevent heart attacks and you prevent deaths with cancer and you prevent all these things, you're going to end up with a lot of people with arthritis and other things that cripple them but don't kill them. And so if you look ahead 10 years into the baby boomers turning 65, not 1 out of 4, but 3 out of 4 will be involved in the care of a member of the family or an extended family. Now, a lot of this is due to the fact that the kind of insurance that has sold most poorly in this country is long-term insurance. It's expensive, but if you can afford it, by all means get it because it pays off in the long run. There just have to be a lot of adjustments to society because the background of all this is that everything you've said is true demographically, but it is also happening in a political and economic environment where Social Security is getting very shaky, where Medicare is getting very shaky, and so we're going to have 2 major changes in the way we deal with money for old people, or the way we deal for health for old people, and they're just 2 of the problems. So in 2 hours of a conversation, we couldn't come to any conclusions except to sort of outline what the problems are, and then to submit those to the kinds of things in government, if we're going to ask the government to do this, who can come up with some loose solutions. I can tell you that I don't think the government should be involved totally in any of these things. If we're going to have changes that involve the government, I think they should be a public-private partnership with one holding the other in check. I think that's the only way that you can avoid the fraud and the waste and the abuse that takes place when you have large sums of money available for people and no sense of accountability that you can check on.
What should the aging baby boomers be doing right now to make things better or easier by the time they are 65?
Well, it's already past the time that they should have made one decision, and that is change their lifestyle so that they don't go up a hill to 65 and go down a long hill through a final illness and die. You can go up this ladder and get up on a plateau and stay up here for a long time. But that means you've got to make decisions when you're 40, 45, and a lot of them didn't do that. The second thing they have to do is to realize that they cannot rely on government to either take care of their health or to take care of their income. And so a lot of people who think they have a little nest egg that's going to provide them with over and above what the government gives them a wonderful life traveling and raising roses and doing all that sort of thing. They're going to have to find that they maybe have to work, maybe they have to do a job, maybe they have to do a lot of things at home they never did before. And it's going to mean a lot of lifestyle changes after 65. But, you know, I'm 85, and I make the facetious comment that the golden years are really only gold-plated. But whether it is real gold or gold-plated depends an awful lot on the kind of preparation that you make and the way the people around you appreciate you and treat you. Mm-hmm. One of the reasons for that, you probably noticed that after 15 years of experimentation, the Netherlands the other day legalized euthanasia. Mm-hmm. Well, it's been essentially legalized for 15 years, but what that means is that we now have creeping into our culture that when things get too tough, get rid of them. Mm-hmm. And that will certainly come here, and we have a lot of ethical decisions. The first will be presented to you in the form of assisted suicide, because that seems so nice and gentle. You do it to yourself, you don't get involved in society. But if you believe in having a pro-life position, and mine is a thoroughly pro-life position, you make life as comfortable for those people and as pain-free for those people and as socially acceptable for those people, so they don't want to kill themselves. And that's one of the obligations that physicians have. Physicians can't do everything. And one of the problems we face in our society is that the public, the culture, has medicalized life. And that's not a good word, but we can use it here. If a woman comes to see a doctor and she has a very strange, funny feeling in her esophagus as though she'd swallowed a hard-boiled egg and it won't go up and it won't go down, and the doctor tries to take care of that, and she goes home and says, I went to the doctor and he gave me some medicine and I still have the same pain. Well, the pain is caused not by the doctor or by his inadequacies, but the fact that her husband's an alcoholic, her mother has Alzheimer's disease, she's got a delinquent child, she's got a son on heroin, and those are not medical problems. Those are social problems that a doctor cannot change. And if he can't change those, you're going to have the hard-boiled egg sitting right here.
Yeah, so it's a very complicated network of relationships. Recently, it came to light that HHS Secretary Tommy Thompson announced that he was going to buy 3 million doses of the smallpox vaccine. This is in the wake of September 11th, for fear of a biological attack with the smallpox virus. What should we make of that? Should Americans become vaccinated with the smallpox vaccine? Is this something we should be worried about?
You should be perfectly honest about what the threats are. We haven't even imagined what the threats can be in the way of biological and chemical warfare. And I feel very strongly that we are very poorly prepared for either of those things. Just a few months ago, I testified before Congress to this effect, and I still believe it. I've written an article in an engineering journal, of all things, about our lack of preparedness about this. But it doesn't mean that you rush out and get vaccinated with smallpox. Our problem a month ago was, if we wanted to vaccinate everybody, we only had 100,000 doses, and we had an awful lot of people, 250 million. And so I would not do that. There is a danger to giving smallpox vaccine to a large number of people. There always are side effects, and some people would get very ill, some people might have permanent disability, and some people might die. And smallpox, you would know when we had a threat from smallpox, and that would be time enough if you have the vaccine, which we now do. But one question nobody has asked is whether a vaccine that has been sitting around in some warehouse, we don't know whether it was refrigerated, not refrigerated, it probably is still sterile, but has anything happened to denature that compound so it no longer is effective? So I would be a little bit careful, and I'd want to see some studies done on animals right now to see whether or not the antibodies against smallpox really bounce up after an animal is injected with it.
Yeah. Well, we're almost out of time. I have far more questions that I'd like to ask you. I'd like to ask one more question, then we can maybe take one or two from the audience very quickly. One thing that I've been reading about is how the demographics with HIV infection have changed to a younger constituency. Most of the infections more recently have come from youth between ages, well, under the age of 25. Are we becoming lackadaisical in our culture about HIV now that we seem to have, with this cocktail treatment, have contained it somewhat, or at least tamed it?
Two things have happened. One of the most remarkable things about the AIDS epidemic was that the homosexual population gathered together, accepted this as their responsibility, and put their own money into educating younger homosexuals. And that was an unknown thing in this country, that a group would do that, and it was very effective. But then these people aged, and there came up other people who were homosexual, and the educational program had stopped. So right now we have the problem that new, young people who have suddenly decided they're homosexual don't have the background that you and I have, having lived through the early days of the epidemic, and they don't know at what tremendous danger they are exposing themselves to if they engage in homosexual relationships. The other thing is that you've implied, and I think is correct, that the cocktails that we now have, so-called, actually, if given to a person early on in the diagnosis of HIV, can probably extend their lives to the normal life expectancy, knowing, of course, all that time that they are contagious to other people, but also, when you know you've got something that can do that, everybody naturally lets their guard down. And so people aren't nearly as careful as they were before. But the problem here is as nothing compared to the problem in sub-Saharan Africa or in parts of India or in Russia. And those places in Africa are facing genocide. And the people affected, as you've just said, are young people. So that means it's the people who run the banks and the post office and the trolley cars and do the farming and so forth. And what will be the economic effect of the loss of all those lives, I don't know. And something I read in the paper, a report of the National Association of Evangelicals, that really disturbed me. And it takes me back to the days of the Reagan White House when his advisors said, they deserve it, let them go. And that is in a poll just taken of the adequate number of people who call themselves evangelicals, less than 3% said they had any intention of giving help to people with HIV or AIDS. And I think that's a very poor showing for evangelicals, because we don't punish people for diseases they have based upon how they caught that disease. And you know, there but for the grace of God go a lot of people who are critical of it. And the second thing, in the same thing that bothered me also about an evangelical report, was that they are the least likely group of people to give to orphans.
Oh, really?
So I think that someplace along the way, Christians, especially conservative Christians, have forgotten that they have a social obligation that goes with their faith.
Yes, especially in a time of crisis such as we face. Well, I wish I could ask every question on my sheets, but I don't want to rob the audience here of a chance. We can only take maybe 2 questions. So is there anyone there, someone there in the back corner there? Try to be very precise and brief in your question.
Okay. Is this
You're on.
Okay. Dr. Koop, do you see any credibility in the studies that link abortion with higher risk of breast cancer? And if you were the Surgeon General in this administration, what would be your first priority?
The report that there is a relationship between abortion and subsequent breast cancer in women, I believe, is absolutely true. It's a very good question. And even though I'm not Surgeon General, I've been trying to do something about it, and I get stonewalled by the people who have the data. New York State, for example, could settle this matter in a week by just making their database available to some epidemiologists, and could prove, which I think they would easily do, that there is a positive relationship and that abortion does lead to breast cancer. But they refuse to let those statistics out, and they give reasons for them, which, as far as I'm concerned, don't hold water in view of the very serious nature of what the problem could be and how you could provide women with one more weapon that they would know about how to prevent breast cancer. Thank you.
Is there another question?
Dr. Koop, welcome to Wheaton College. I would just like to know a little bit more about your personal testimony, your personal statement of faith in Jesus Christ.
My personal statement of faith in Jesus Christ. All right. I believe that I was born a sinner and am a sinner by preference, a sinner by experience, and will be until the day I die. And by sin, I mean any deviation from the purity and holiness of God, which means that everybody's got that. And I believe that it's impossible for me to do anything by myself to straighten the gap out between me and God on that issue. And I believe that Jesus Christ, the only begotten Son of God, came to this earth in order to be a substitute for my sin. And to put it as simply as I can, at this time, I believe that my sin can only be in one of two places. It can be on me, in which case God will have to, in His justice, punish me for it, or it can be on Jesus Christ, who already accepted that punishment at Calvary. And so I am justified by faith. And I like to include as much as I can. I think what we should be grateful to God for is providing us with the scripture that makes this clear to us, to thank Him for providing us with the faith, itself a gift, that allows us to believe it, to thank Him for providing us also with the other things that go with Christian development, so that we can, in the eventual end, glorify God by the things that He has given us in gifts to bring us to that point of the knowledge of our salvation.
Dr. Koop, thank you very much for spending this evening with us and for sharing your wisdom. There's so much more I wish I could ask, but we've just run out of time. But thank you very much. I would also like to thank Wheaton College and the Center for Applied Christian Ethics for sponsoring this evening with Dr. Koop. And thank you for tuning in. Good night.